Hi folks, this is Kiffer with this week's lecture on quantitative data collection. So this week we'll focus on data collection and methods. I really just want to give you a brief overview of what's in the textbook because I think what's provided there is pretty robust in terms of the various methods used in data collection, some of the pitfalls to avoid when designing surveys, and some of the key ideas of what quantitative data collection is. So to begin, let's answer that question about what quantitative data collection is. And so quantitative data collection is sometimes kind of an ambiguous term, as some of you and I have discussed earlier last week, that when we measure the quantity of something, that's often what's described as quantitative data. And then when we measure the quality of something, that's what we often describe as qualitative data. However, when we were talking about data collection and mixed methods and quantitative and qualitative data collection, we're really talking about the method used to collect the data and how that data kind of is represented numerically. And so quantitative data collection is predominantly done via in-person surveys, so maybe somebody's outside of a clinic or in the lobby of a clinic and surveying people. Maybe it's somebody at a student union surveying college students. Maybe it's somebody who's gone to a festival of some sort and is collecting data there. And so that's an in-person survey. Then there's telephone surveys. This often uses kind of random digit dialing. Of course, we know that not everyone has a phone that's accessible via random digit dialing. So telephone surveys have their advantages in that they can create a kind of somewhat random sample of people with phones. Oftentimes, various methods are pulled together and then weighted to try to create a more representative sample than you might get from just a telephone or just an in-person survey or just an online survey. There's also mailing methodologies where you can mail out your survey. Then there's also the computer-assisted surveys, which are probably becoming increasingly the favorite way to survey people because they're quick, cheap, easy to conduct. An online survey allows you to kind of automatically program skip logic and display logic, which we'll talk a bit more about later in the lecture. And so all these survey methods are great ways to collect quantitative data. Now, you could collect what we consider qualitative data as part of a quantitative survey, right? You could have an open-ended question that asks something like, tell me about an experience where a healthcare provider denied you a service and how did that make you feel, right? You could potentially collect that via a dialogue box where they could write down their experience and then you could analyze that data qualitatively. And so, so it's important to recognize that there's a bit crossover in terms of methods as well. But I think a great way to distinguish quantitative from qualitative data, at least for the way we use the terms in this course, is to think about whether or not it can be stored numerically, whether or not the data could be transformed into numeric symbols. So you can think of this as like quantitative data can be descriptive. It can describe a quality of something as well as a quantity of something, or it can be numeric, which means it's simply represented by a number. And so generally, the questions that can be stored numerically are those that are closed-ended, have limited response options, something like ethnicity. You can see here, we might ask, what is your ethnicity? And they can choose from various options. And then those options could be transformed to a set of numbers because, theoretically, there's only so many ethnicities. You might allow for another category of some sort. We'll talk a bit about other categories later. But you can see that ultimately a numeric representation of this ethnicity data could easily be stored in something like an Excel sheet and represent that data well. And so I would say a question like ethnicity could be measured in a quantitative survey quite easily. But then there's this question about, tell me about a time when you were proud of your community heritage. And so in this case, the responses would probably vary dramatically. It'd be too difficult to assign specific numbers. Now, you could go through and code that data and look for specific characteristics, but that's a qualitative analytic approach, even though sometimes you might code those into numeric codes, or you might score responses in some way. and try to numericize at that. But I would say predominantly we should focus on this definition of quantitative being about how the data is collected, and then how are you going to analyze that data? Are you going to use qualitative analytic techniques or quantitative techniques? So are you going to summarize it numerically? Are you going to give me a percent or proportion of people with a certain outcome? I would say then that's a quantitative data. If you're going to tell me about themes and codes and ideas that were fleshed out of the data, then that would be a qualitative approach. So hopefully that's a bit clear to you to recognize that like that full scope of from collection to analysis is really what defines quantitative versus qualitative data. And we'll talk more about qualitative data in the coming weeks as well. So quantitative research methods tend to be useful when you're surveying a large number of people. You want to get lots of people's insights. You want to figure out what the average maybe of an outcome is, what the mean, median, all those sort of things. Anytime when you're interested in kind of larger populations. So if you want to know how do all patients in our clinics feel about a specific service that you're offering, you could survey them and get all of their responses. Because, if you have, say, 20,000 people visiting your clinic a year, it's much easier to do a survey quantitatively than to interview 20,000 people and try to manage that data analysis, which I think we can get a sense would be quite impossible. Usually qualitative studies focus around 30 or 40 people at max, maybe a little bit higher than that, but most of the time 30, 40 is probably all you'll see in a qualitative study. So quantitative data gets you those large numbers of individuals that you're interested in. You also need to be fairly certain about what constructs or themes or ideas you want to measure, and ensure that there's actually a way to measure them, right? That there's a way to measure that in a survey. Some things like people's experiences, say growing up as a minority, those can have, certainly there's some elements of that you could measure via psychological scales, something like minority stress scale, experiences of discrimination scale. Like you could capture a lot of information numerically about somebody, but those constructs have to be fairly well defined, or you have to be developing questions that you believe will measure those wells. And so that gets into psychometrics, which is beyond the scope of this course, but certainly you can develop constructs if you don't have them fully defined yet. But generally that quantitative data collection needs to be fairly rigorous in terms of, you want to ask, the sorts of answers that people will give. If you, for instance, have never studied anything like why people delay care and you have no idea why people are delaying care, you wouldn't want to just rush right in and develop a question that says, why have you delayed care? And then have response options that you just come up with. You would like to really flesh out those constructs ahead of time, perhaps through qualitative interviews, which we'll talk about when we talk about mixed method studies, how quantitative data and qualitative data can really be used to work together. And so the other feature is that generally these need to be closed-ended responses. As I note later in the lecture and in the textbook, open-ended questions are a question type often used on quantitative surveys, but these open-ended questions tend to be analyzed using qualitative methods, not summarized statistically or numerically. And so as we think about data collection and the ways that we design studies, I want to draw this contrast again. Earlier in the course, we talked about this, how epidemiological research tends to be a bit different in evaluation, even though they're kind of subsets of each other. So in epidemiology, we often do studies like cross-sectional studies. You learned this in epidemiology. So, they do cross-sectional studies, case control studies, cohort studies, case crossover studies. There's probably a number of more study designs out there that epidemiology kind of teaches you in a classic epidemiology class. In an evaluations framework, generally, we like to think of the characteristics of the study and how it relates to how you would evaluate an intervention. And so these tend to be a cross of kind of what we call experimental and quasi-experimental study designs, because your goal is basically to assess the value of something. And so experiments and quasi-experimental designs are how we evaluate those. And so evaluation study designs uses that framework of experimental study designs. It certainly shares a lot of things with case crossovers, with case control studies, even in nature cohort studies, because they tend to be longitudinal. But anyways, the evaluation study designs vary. The textbook talks about a number of these. Those ones on the slides now are all included in the text. These are the ones that you should have some idea about. Now, most of them convey most of what you need to know just from the title. But I do want you to spend some time getting familiar with those, make sure that you kind of understand some of their strengths and limitations. As we do that, I thought the best way to cover this material would just be to kind of give you the main features of evaluation study designs. So you can mix and match, pull some of these in, not use some of them sometimes. And that basically is what creates all these various different types of study designs. And so kind of the first thing that most will require is some sort of post-test. The post-test is conducted usually at the end of your study. Once an intervention has been completed, it allows you to collect information about people and their experiences in your intervention. You can imagine this is to assess feasibility or acceptability. You could ask questions like, how did you enjoy participating in the study? Would you participate in this study again, or would you participate in this intervention again? Would you recommend this intervention to a friend? Those sort of questions that allow you to assess the experience. You can also collect demographic intervention information as part of a post-test. So that could tell you, who did this work for and who didn't, who did like it, who did not. So those are the sort of questions you can look at when you're just using a post-test study. If you add a pre-test to that, it adds this added benefit of being able to demonstrate improvements over time. So you could say, like, you could measure smoking behavior or substance use prior to an intervention, then you have the intervention and you measure after, maybe 6 months after or so, and see, did it actually result in changes in people's behavior? Did an intervention maybe looking at changes in physical functioning, that sort of thing? By combining the pre-test and post-test, you can then kind of make that longitudinal decision about the quality of the intervention. Now, the next kind of feature that is important to add is this idea of control groups, because we talked about last week when we were talking about validity that there are lots of alternative explanations that can explain a specific outcome. And so, so a control group allows you to get rid of some of those alternative explanations by allowing you to compare, particularly if you have both a pre-test and post-test, you can compare, well, how did controls improve over time relative to cases? And so that would tell you, okay, well, if both cases and controls both improved and they improved at about the same amount, then that kind of tells you, well, maybe there's not a whole lot of difference here in the intervention, and some alternative explanation explains why both groups increased. The challenge here is that the findings may be confounded by differences between groups, and so oftentimes the best thing to do is, if you're able to, is to randomize people into the treatment and control group. And so this is different from a non-equivalent control group, because once you randomize people, the assumption is that kind of those individual differences that might confound your findings are evenly distributed, randomly distributed between your treatments and controls. And so oftentimes your control group will have a placebo or maybe a kind of the best gold standard comparison that you're trying to show that your evaluation is either better than or as good as, yeah. And so, so that's the kind of the main features of evaluation study designs that I want you to know. The next part of this focuses on basically the types of questions and then what pitfalls to avoid. And so definitely the most common type of question in a quantitative survey is this fixed choice survey. You can see that you have a question like, how would you describe yourself politically? And people could select from some subset, some number of questions. They could select just one of those. Now that's not always ideal. We'll talk about in pitfalls. This is an example I just pulled from a survey I found online. But like, people might identify as far right. They might identify also as conservative. People who might also centrist, non-political might be the same, maybe libertarian. So people might have different combinations of these. So fixed choice isn't always ideal. It's really good for when you just want them to be able to select one option and only one option. And that's what a fixed choice is. Their choice is fixed. They get one option to select. And so that's fixed choice. Then you have this check all that apply. This is actually from a survey that we do kind of on a semi-annual basis at Pride Parade festivals for LGBT folks, and then also online. And so this question is from the paper survey, and we just asked, have any of the following caused you to delay or skip? And here they could check all of those apply. So they could say they were too busy, they were stressed out, their hours were inconvenient. Those are the things that contributed. And so they allow them to select multiple options. So that's called a check all that apply question. One problem with the check all that apply question is if, for instance, they don't click that no delays or skipped STI testing in the past year, and they don't select any, you don't know if just nothing applied or if they just missed the question. And so generally, if you're doing a computerized survey, it's best to require responses and then have some sort of no delay or skipped STI testing in the past year option, so that you know whether or not they actually filled out the question, because otherwise that's going to determine how they get entered into your data set. If they didn't check any of these, then you would assume that none of them applied, when in fact maybe they just missed the page or something, or missed the question or skimmed over it. And so it's important with check all that apply questions to have a non-response option for them to select. The next thing, sorry this is a bit pixelated, but this next thing is a matrix style question. Now matrix style questions are just usually like fixed choice questions, except for maybe you have one header with lots of different options. You see this a lot with like psychological scales that ask people to read statements and then rate, how well does this describe you? Very well, somewhat not well, not well at all. Or maybe how they agree with the statement, strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. These are known as Likert scales, and so oftentimes matrix style questions will use those, but they can also be used for assessing substance use. So that's the example here in the slide now. And then finally, the open-ended qualitative questions. This is a question we ask in the Momentum survey, which is a Vancouver biobehavioral survey of gay and bisexual men. And we kind of finish off the survey with just a nice, fun question, but we ask, what is your idea of a great date? And they could then qualitatively fill out what their idea of a great first date or whatever date would be. And so that's an open-ended question. This couldn't be analyzed quantitatively. So I would say this is a qualitative collection data source that's collected as part of a quantitative study. Because in the data set, this will just be long sentences or paragraphs of people describing their first date, not coded as like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or even as the various levels of a category. So then in pitfalls to avoid, I think it's really important. Kind of two basic things is, one, don't ignore or exhaust your participants. If you put a lot of cognitive load into completing a survey, if it feels tedious, difficult, repetitive, if questions don't seem relevant to them, if response options don't seem relevant to them, then that's going to really annoy them, and they're going to, especially if it's an online survey, they're just going to click away and be like, okay, I'm done with this survey. So you're not going to have much usable data from that. This means also avoiding a lot of the bells and whistles. I know a lot of survey designs like SurveyMonkey and Qualtrics have all these various different survey design formats. You can add pictures and smiley faces and all these sort of things. Generally, the research on those is just avoid them. It makes it too cognitive, to complete the survey. The goal should be to have a survey that's as easy to complete as possible, and that when cognitive load is demanded, that it's actually demanded for them to answer the question, not to just complete the survey. So the next thing that you want to make sure is that you don't ask poor quality questions. And so in the textbooks, I give a lot of examples of these kind of what we describe as poor quality questions with ways to improve them. I'm just going to summarize those here today. I do want you to be able to look at a question and say, is that question a double-barreled question? Does that have inadequate response options? Is it double negative? Those sort of things you should be able to look at a survey and see. And also when you're completing the assignment for this week, which we'll cover in a moment, it will be to create a survey. You want to make sure that you avoid these questions. If you've got any of these sort of pitfalls for poor quality questions, you'll lose a point. So the first one is kind of double-barreled questions. That's when you ask two things in the same question, something like, how do you feel about your nurse and doctor? Somebody might feel great about the nurse, but not feel good about the doctor. And so when you ask those questions together, it becomes hard to answer. So that's a double barrel question. Inadequate response options. This is common when you don't have an exhaustive list of options. And so things like education, right? If you only ask, what is your highest level of education, and you only ask like high school diploma, some college degree, graduate school degree, right? But there's people who did trade schools, there's people who did all these sort of other programs, certificate programs, maybe they completed some high school. You need to be able to give the response options that allows every person to adequately classify themselves. The next thing is the other response options. Now, I know this is important. Oftentimes we include another response option simply so that people can kind of delegate, to identify themselves as having some unique circumstance that doesn't fit into the fixed choice. And certainly you can use that list to identify, what do we need to add into our list of response options. But the other response options generally can't be recoded to create new categories. Lots of people think that, oh, I can add the other, and then if a critical mass of people choose a new other option, then I can create that new one. That's actually really not a great practice, because people who didn't have the idea to use the other may have fit themselves in somewhere else when really they fit better in that other. And so because they didn't have the option to choose that category when it was available, that means the new category is going to have poor sensitivity, meaning it's not going to be able to pick people up who identify that way. And so so generally we include those other response options, but it is important to recognize that that's not necessarily for the sake of this survey. Sometimes it's to give people an opportunity to express themselves. That I think can have definitely some legitimate and important value. But it's hard to analyze that data. And so I just kind of warn that. You could definitely have the other response option, not a problem, not going to get marked off if you have other, especially if it seems like an appropriate area to have one. The next is kind of double negatives or negatively framed questions. These are just often difficult to understand. So double negative is where you say, you should not do that, right? That becomes, it's like, well, should I do that or should I not do that? Should I not means don't, or does it mean do, right? So double negatives can be just very hard for people to understand. And then also negatively framed questions that try to cast kind of dispersion, can also kind of lead to bias. There's also a number of other question formats that we have that we continue in this list. Is leading questions lead to bias, right? So leading question is where the way you've asked the question kind of leads to a specific answer. So the question might be like, did you find that this was the best program that you ever participated in, right? And the options are yes or no. All that positive language, best program that you've ever participated in, right? That's going to lead to some bias. It leads people to a concluded answer. Certainly leading questions can be more subtle than that. So usually you try to balance it out. So you might say, instead of saying, for example, do you agree with this person? You might say, do you agree or disagree with this person, right? You balanced it out. The next thing is loaded questions. Loaded questions are kind of built on unjustified assumptions. These can vary between groups. So I think the example in the textbook that I use is like safe sex, right? What do you mean by safe sex? So that's kind of loaded because it has this, conception of safety, and so what is safety? What does that mean to who? Whose definition of safety are you using? Right. So loaded questions tend to kind of have all this extra meaning. And you should try to avoid that if you can. Sometimes I know psychological scales do use this. And so, for example, for the sake of the assignment, if you're using a validated scale, you'd want to clarify that in the notes, because we do allow you to develop the survey, and then part of the assignment is to develop a bit of context for the survey instrument, how it's going to be used, and that sort of thing. If you've got questions that you think, wow, these are poor quality questions, these violate Dr. Card's rules about questions, then make sure to make note of that and say, this question is, but however, it's part of a validated survey, and therefore we're going to keep the question as is. And so that's definitely fine to do. The next thing is avoid absolutist questions. And so it's like, do you always, take your medicine on time? Well, people might usually take their medicine on time, but then be reticent to saying always. And so absolutist questions require people to make absolutist claims. Generally, people don't like to make absolutist claims, so that can lead to bias. Also, assuming questions when you assume something is known. So the example I have here is like in the textbook, something like, what do you think about Bill C-13 or C-133? That requires them to know what the bill is. And so assuming questions, don't assume that your population has a great understanding of what you're talking about. Sometimes assumptions can be made, but my general recommendation is just not to take many assumptions for granted. Then also thinking about insensitive questions. Those are questions that aren't culturally sensitive to the target population. Big key things here are things like nationality, ethnicity, race, gender, sexual orientation. You want to make sure that those variables are developed kind of in ways that are sensitive to the populations that you're going to ask. Also, asking some of the wrong questions to the wrong target populations, right? If you're interviewing, grandmas in their 80s, and you're interviewing them for, a lot of stigmatizing type behaviors, that might not be cultural appropriate. So you need to, as you think about cultural appropriateness, you need to be thinking about, is it appropriate for this audience, this target audience as well? And so that's an important feature. So avoid those insensitive questions. And then the non-exclusive response option, this is kind of like the example earlier where you don't have enough options, where your response options overlap. And so instead of people not being able to classify themselves, these people have too many options to classify themselves. Probably the biggest one I see this in is with questions that assess marital status. Something like, are you married? Are you single? Are you divorced? Are you separated? Well, somebody could be married and divorced, right? They could be previously divorced, but now in a second marriage. And so making sure to ask questions in a way that people fit only into one of those categories. If you have a fixed choice response option is important. If not, then design it as a check all that apply question. If you think that people can have check all that apply as options. However, I would say that the best thing to do is just to develop more discrete fixed choice options than just to default to, well, maybe they can check all that apply here, because check all that apply questions are definitely more difficult to analyze. Finally, middle response options. So this is the idea of providing a neutral. You see this on a lot of psychological scales. So from strongly agree to strongly disagree, they'll have like in the middle, neither disagree or agree. Well, the problem with those is then when you decide to split, or if it's calculated as part of a scale, it might not matter so much. You could have that label in there if it's part of a scale. But say that you want to break down, how friendly is, or say my doctor is friendly, strongly agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. The question becomes, who do you put the neutral with if you're going to dichotomize that variable, right? So that's difficult. Also, people will tend to choose neutral options just because they're available. And so kind of forcing people to choose between one or the other is generally an easier way analytically, especially if your plan isn't to treat the variable as a continuous variable, but to dichotomize it, which means that you're taking multiple options and just combining the responses. So maybe you combine strongly agree, and you combine strongly disagree with disagree. That's kind of what I mean here. So that becomes difficult. Certainly there are examples of this happening, but I think generally best option is just to remove the neutral response option if it's not necessary, or if it doesn't add information to your analyses. And finally, the use of unbalanced scales. And so you often see this with Likert scales. Unbalanced scales basically provide more options for one side of the scale than for other. And so maybe you're like strongly agree, somewhat agree, disagree, strongly disagree. You notice there were 3 options that allowed somebody to agree, but only 2 to disagree. And so that's an unbalanced scale. And so that biases the scale in the direction of the unbalance. So in that case, towards more agreement. And so make sure that you avoid those pitfalls. Now this is important for the week's assignment because, as I mentioned earlier, your week's assignment is to design a questionnaire. So I want you to design a questionnaire that I call ready for distribution. So it should look aesthetically pleasing, it should be nice, easy to complete, not overcrowded. You use bold and underlined text, you use an easy to read font. And then when you're asking about gender, ethnicity, those sort of things, you're making sure to collect that data from kind of in a well-respected, culturally sensitive manner, all that sort of thing. So avoid all those pitfalls we discussed about. As you do this, I hope that you'll use validated measures that have kind of previously been validated. Certainly you can propose, doing something different, but try to use validated measures if they exist, particularly if it's for specific constructs that lend themselves to being measured using a validated measure. For the sake of this assignment, you'll probably have multiple ways of collecting data. Sorry about that. I have a bit of a cold, so dealing with that. But certainly you're going to have multiple ways of collecting data for your proposed evaluation. For the sake of this assignment, you only need to develop one survey. Then you can develop those other things like forms, interview guides, and so far in future assignments. I'm sorry again. And then finally, the last thing I want to say is that you need to write a brief kind of summary that contextualizes your survey. And this assignment will be graded on how well developed and appropriate the questions are, so avoiding all those pitfalls. The design and aesthetics of the survey should be appealing and easily accessible, shouldn't frustrate Dr. Landy as she's grading it. And then the target populations, objectives, and distribution methods need to be well articulated in your summary. And so that's this week's assignment. Next week is quiz number 1. And then the week after that, we'll cover quantitative data analysis. And so quiz number 1 will cover all the lectures from today's lecture past. And so I think that's kind of chapters 1 through 5. And then next week we'll do a section on quantitative data analysis. And so that ranges, will require you to think back to your epidemiology and biostatistics courses. We'll provide a brief overview, but the main focus of this course isn't necessarily on how to calculate things, it's how to know when to use the right methods. And so for those of you who are a little bit anxious about math and statistics, the main focus will be knowing when to apply the right methods. And so look forward to that, I guess. And then in kind of relation to that, we provide a lot of resource for choosing which test to use. This one that I have listed here by NYU is probably one of the best ones I've seen. And so on the test, you're welcome to use a resource like this to identify which test to use. And so I recommend you use this one because it's probably the best one I've seen. It has a lot of options and that sort of thing. So with that, hope you have a good week. And that if you have any questions, I look forward to talking with you on the discussion board. Okay, bye.